slightest amount of research on high CO2 levels that they say is so high and so strong that it's changing our climate. And that's what it is. Global warming, it's changing the Earth's climate. That's how powerful this CO2 emissions are. Well, anyone that's done even a small amount of research on CO2, go back in history and look at what it was like when CO2 was 100 times what it is now. What did we have then? Well, yeah, you had some climate change, but CO2 is also food for plants. Green plants love CO2. That's their food. So when you overfeed something, what happens? If you go back and look, when CO2 levels were 50 or 100 times higher than what they are now, you had huge plants. I mean, go back and look at the dinosaurs and during that time. I mean, you had ferns that had 8 and 10 foot leaves. You had huge, giant plants. These plants were giant because CO2 is food for plants. The more you feed them, the more they grow, the bigger they get. So if our CO2 level right now is so incredibly high and powerful that it's strong enough to change the climate, why has it had no effect on plants? You see, you can't. That's like saying you jumped into the water, but only your feet got wet. I mean, if you jump in the water, the effect is everything gets wet. Everything. So if CO2 levels are so high they're changing the climate, then why aren't other results from high CO2 being seen? Why do we not have these huge plants, giant plants, and all of the other consequences? I could do a whole show just on that. Just on all of the consequences that come from high CO2. But they're telling us around the world, not just in America, that the only consequence of high CO2 is climate change. There are no other consequences. They'll say, oh, yeah, there's other consequences. Oh, yeah? Okay, well, it's food for plants. Why are the plants not affected? If it's strong change of climate, why are plants not affected at all? Why do we not see blades of grass the size of your shoe? You know, why do we not see strawberries the size of a basketball? How about a strawberry the size of an orange? How about a strawberry that's any amount different? No, you don't see that. You know why? Because this whole CO2 climate change thing is a bunch of hooey. Now, I'll agree that climate's changing. You know, we are told in the Bible that in the last days that's what's going to happen. The climate's going to change. This is not man-made. And it's not through CO2 levels. Now, CO2 levels are up, but they're not up to a critical stage that would change the climate because there's no other effects. You can't have just the climate being affected alone. We would see other things. These people would be able, the climate change people would be able to look around and say, it's not only changing the climate, but look what else it's doing. These plants are huge. Have you ever seen a pumpkin that big? It's the size of a Volkswagen Bug. I mean, you don't see that because it's all a bunch of hooey. And instead, they're using this climate tax and this carbon tax, just like I talked about in the last program. In Australia, you folks almost came to blows in your parliament. You were fighting over this because they were collecting this global carbon tax and saying they were using it locally to improve the environment and upgrade everything, when in fact they were sending this as a tax to the UN, lying right to your face. Well, just like many people have tirelessly documented, the elite drive for population control is not based around a philanthropic urge to improve living standard. It's eugenics. And it's moving fast. And I want to talk about sterilization and sterilization in our popular culture. This is going to lead us now. I want to play this I want to play this interview with Margaret Sanger so that you can hear her voice. She is the founder of Planned Parenthood. She started the Negro Project in Harlem in 1923. She is the one that has taken this whole idea of changing it to Planned Parenthood from the eugenics movement that it was called before, and her goal being to eliminate the black population in Harlem in 1923. She was very successful at this. As she grew and started these other quote-unquote health clinics, she acquired a huge staff, all of eugenists. So let me play this clip for you. And I know there's been some of you that have been waiting for this, because this clip is so funny, because it's got Mike Wallace doing this cigarette commercial. This is pretty good stuff. But you'll hear the voice of Margaret Sanger and what she says. Please listen to this clip. This is from 1957.
Good evening. What you're about to witness is an unrehearsed, uncensored interview on the issue of birth control. It will be a free discussion of an adult topic, a topic that we feel merits public examination. My name is Mike Wallace. The cigarette is Philip Morris.
New Philip Morris, probably the best natural smoke you ever tasted, presents the Mike Wallace Interview.
Tonight we go after the story of the woman who violated convention and bucked powerful opposition to lead the birth control movement in America. You see her behind me. She is Mrs. Margaret Sanger, who was thrown into jail 8 different times for her efforts. If you're curious to know why Mrs. Sanger has devoted her life to the birth control movement, if you'd like to hear her answer to the charge that birth control is a sin, and if you want to get her views on politics, divorce, and God, we'll go after those stories in just a moment. My guests' opinions are not necessarily mine. The stations are my sponsors, Philip Morris Incorporated, but whether you agree or disagree, we feel that none should deny the right of these views to be broadcast. One might say that the basis of this program is fact and fiction. And using that yardstick, I'd like to apply it to something I usually talk about at this time, and that is this: Philip Morris cigarettes. Here's why I smoke them and enjoy them. Fact 1. Today's Philip Morris is no ordinary blend. It's a special blend of domestic and imported tobaccos. Opinion? My taste may be different from yours, but on this I think we can agree. This cigarette tastes natural. I think you'll like it. Fact 2. Today's Philip Morris is made of mild, lighter leaf tobaccos. Opinion? To me, that accounts for the genuine mildness I get in every puff. It's what I call a man's kind of mildness. There's no filter, no fooling, no artificial mildness, because, you see, there's nothing between you and the tobacco itself. And fact 3 is, of course, this box. Philip Morris was the first non-filter cigarette to come in a crush-proof box. Opinion? A cigarette that keeps better, smokes better. So get with Philip Morris yourself and check these facts. And when you do, I think you'll find it's probably the best natural smoke you ever tasted. And now to our story. When Mrs. Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States back in 1916, birth control was a dirty word. The police threw her into jail, as they were to do 7 more times during her crusade, a crusade that still faces the reasoning but unalterable opposition of the Roman Catholic Church. That crusade kept Mrs. Sanger away from her children for long periods. It helped to break up her first marriage, and she suffered constant, harrowing social abuse. Mrs. Sanger, in view of all of that, let me ask you this first of all. Why did you do it? I realize that you had an intellectual conviction that birth control was a boon to mankind, but I'm sure that others have that conviction too. And so what I'd like to know is this: what events, what emotions in your life made Margaret Sanger a crusader for birth control?
Well, Mr. Wallace, it's hard to say that any one thing has made one do this or that. I think from the very beginning, I came with a large family. My mother died young, 11 children. That made an impression on me as a child. I was a trained nurse, went among the people. I saw women who asked to have some means whereby they wouldn't have to have another pregnancy too early after the last child, the last abortion, which many of them had. So there's a number of things that are one after the other that really made you feel that you had to do something.
There are some other possible reasons that suggest themselves on reading your biography by Lawrence later. Your mother, as you say, died prematurely after bearing 11 children. She was born a Catholic, was she not?
She was born a Catholic, yes.
And
in Ireland.
Your father was a sort of a village atheist who clashed with church authorities, and because of his atheism, his earnings dwindled under community pressure. You and your brothers and sisters were known as, quote, children of the devil, end quote. Could it be, then, that in part at least, you were driven emotionally toward the birth control movement because of antagonism toward the church, because that was a way to fight the church?
No, I don't think I had anything of the kind in mind. I was what I would call a born humanitarian. I don't like to see people suffer. I don't like to see cruelty, even to this day. And in nursing, you see a great deal of cruelty and unnecessary suffering. At that time, there was no opposition as far as the church was concerned, any church. It was mainly the law, the federal law and state laws that one had to think of. The church was not in my mind at all.
Well, in going after your motive, then, and I will press you just a little bit more about that and then get to the specifics of this evening, but in your motive, in the movement, is it possible that the movement itself, the feeling of wanting to do anything that you felt was important, that perhaps that moved you a good deal? Because the fact remains that you led a movement against overwhelming pressures that stemmed back for centuries, and in doing so, according to your autobiography, you even left your first husband. And you wrote this to a friend, Mrs. Sanger. You said, "Where is the man to give me what the movement gives in joy and interest and freedom?" Now, what was this joy, this freedom that you craved?
Well, I don't remember that letter, who it was written, but I think that it was not a question of marriage at all. There was a certain satisfaction in doing something that was going to alleviate the sufferings of women in particular, and I was quite a feminist at the time.
Obviously.
And yes, and I naturally didn't want to see women take all the suffering of childbearing and of pregnancies. So it was a pleasure, in a sense, to think that you were striking at an archaic law, which it was, put it on the statute book by Anthony Comstock some years ago, and no one had stood up against it. No one had tried to change the laws. And at that time, not even a doctor had a right to use the United States mails and common carriers for books, for learning, for anything that he had to do with this question. It was considered obscene. The whole question was considered obscene.
Mrs. Sanger, you have helped to spread the birth control movement not only here in the United States, but in Europe and the Orient as well. Why? Why is birth control of such vital importance internationally? Is it just to save women suffering? Is that the only reason in your mind?
Well, not entirely. The population question is a great concern today, and the rate at which the births come in to we're saving them now. At one time, when children died, they didn't have the food. Today, our population all over the world is getting certainly better consideration and better conditions than they had at the time that I was there. I went to every country because I was invited. And I didn't go into the country myself. I was invited to go to Japan and to speak there, have 8 lectures on the question of birth control and peace.
Well, do you believe that birth control is essential if we want to keep millions of people across the world from starving? Is that your thesis?
Say it again.
Do you feel that birth control is essential to keep millions of people across the world from starving?
Well, I think the birth control, if you keep your population more or less static until you pick up your resources certainly you